Let's get some analysis now, and joining me is Gus McLachlan, a former Major General in the Australian Army and strategist in the Army. Gus McLachlan, thanks for your time. What was your read on this? Sporadic missiles into Kyiv and other civilian areas in Ukraine. What does it say about Putin's strategy or lack thereof?
Yeah, Kieran, g'day. The term that was used in the report was doubled down. This has got personal for Putin. The Kerch Causeway Bridge he personally opened in 2018. He described it as something Russian leaders had wanted to do for hundreds of years, and clearly it's an iconic bridge for him and for Russian civilization. So it was very much a poke in the eye for Putin, and he has reacted personally by we understand over 100 cruise missiles launched into population centres in Ukraine. So this is significant escalation of a dangerous leader who is increasingly being pushed into a corner.
Yes, and so let's start with these missiles hitting, as you said, civilian areas. If it's about trying to damage morale, the Ukrainian people and its military has proved incredibly resilient. If anything, you would imagine this will steel their resolve.
Yeah, I can't see any military sense in these attacks. Attacks on populations have failed in the past. We're aware of things like the German blitz on the English population during World War II. A population like the Ukrainian population with high morale, strong leadership, they know they have international support. This won't weaken their resolve. We know already some of the countries that perhaps had drifted into alignment with Putin are starting to back away from the table even further. So this is the sign of a desperate leader. But I think we need to be cautious because this is a period where Putin is now putting a really significant red line in the sand. Successful Ukrainian counterattacks have seized back considerable territory. It looks like they will probably be successful down near Kherson, pushing Russian forces soon back over the Dnieper River. The Ukrainians now would aspire to throw the Russians all the way back across the border. And I think what's shaping is the area of Crimea, which the Russians annexed in 2014, is going to be an absolute red line for Putin, which of course is bringing into the question of possible use of nuclear weapons on the continent of Europe, something we would have believed to be absolutely inconceivable 9 months ago.
So that goes to that point you spoke about, that he's increasingly been pushed into a corner. Joe Biden talks about comparisons with the Cuban Missile Crisis, and as you said, this threat now of a dictator humiliated, resorting to the use of nuclear weapons.
Yeah, I still find it inconceivable that he would think that there is a possible productive use of these weapons. Some people talk about these as lower yield or tactical weapons. They are still broadly in the range of the weapons that were used in World War II over Nagasaki and Hiroshima. So these are not trivial devices. These are not tactical devices in any way. And I think the use of those weapons on the mainland Europe would ultimately isolate Russia for decades into the future. So I'm probably different to some pundits who have talked about 20 or 30% likelihood of these weapons. I think they still remain relatively unlikely. I perhaps put a figure of 5%. But even saying 5% chance of the use of nuclear weapons in Europe, again, inconceivable only 9 or 10 months ago.
It really is. And so before we move on to a few other issues, I want to get your thoughts on, including the Australian Defence Force and our expenditure on that, cost blowouts and so on. Before we move on from Ukraine, what is your best guess now then in terms of how this transpires from here? Obviously, the Ukrainian forces have had the momentum and have made the gains. How does it unfold from here? We know winter just around the corner.
Look, hugely important topic. Kieran, I know you've just finished an economic report. All of these things play into future commodity prices, inflation, likelihood of a recession in Europe. I have two plausible hypotheses or two possible courses of action. The first is that the mobilisation of these Russian reserves and the onset of winter slows down Ukrainian counter-offensives, and we see a sort of stalemate emerging in Ukraine around Christmas. Putin could then ratchet up the pressure on gas prices, and he could potentially choke off the release of these wheat ships out into the Black Sea, and then ultimately attempt to sue for some sort of peace where he could save face and preserve some of this seized territory. That, of course, would be completely unacceptable to President Zelensky, but perhaps Putin might find it acceptable. The other entirely plausible course of action is that we see Russian will to fight collapse even faster. And that's looking possible. The discipline and the morale in Russian forces has declined rapidly, very poor leadership, the endemic corruption, the signs we are seeing of corrupt materiel, equipment being pilfered. We're seeing, armoured tiles being opened up, and instead of explosives inside them, they've been filled with rubber. So the extent of Russian corruption is now clear to the soldiers. And if I was one of those soldiers, I'd be thinking really hard about whether this was worth dying for. And so we may see a collapse of Russian will. The question will then be if the Ukrainians push hard and fast, push the Russians out of the territories seized in the last 8 months, but then approach the territory seized in 2014, that again puts Putin right back in the corner near one of his red lines, and again, for me, raises the risk of Putin, retaliating with nuclear weapons. So a couple of plausible options there. Neither of them mean a short end to the war, and I don't see a easy way out of this yet for some months to come.
On to the ADF, and yesterday the minister talking about these cost blowouts. He basically taking a more activist role as minister, more ministerial summits, bringing together the military and defence industry, trying to keep a lid on prices. Is he going the right way about that?
Well, having an activist minister is absolutely what's needed. One of our weaknesses in our democracy is we have rotated defence ministers far too quickly. I think the number is 10 or 12 in the last 15 years. You can't do good governance of that of a complex organisation like Defence with rotating ministers. So Mr. Miles has spent a long time in the shadow role. I worked with him when I was in uniform. He has worked hard to understand the organisation, and long may he remain in that portfolio so that we can see some consistency. One of the things you have to grapple with in defence acquisition is balancing risk to the taxpayers' money, often with reduced speed and tempo of acquisition. That was okay 10 or 15 years ago when the world was relatively benign. You could be slow and cautious. What we're seeing as we look at things like cruise missiles striking into the heart of Ukraine, the emergence of a very belligerent China under Xi Jinping, the Pelosi visit to Taiwan, showed the extent to which an assertive China will push out into the South China Sea and possibly encircle Taiwan. All of those things make defence acquisition far more urgent and more timely. So the minister's got a job on his hands. Now, generally, there's three things you can manipulate, Kieran, when you're in acquisition. Cost, schedule and capability. So the minister's talking about trying to get cost under control, and that's absolutely important. But usually that means if you tighten up on cost, that means schedule will slip, things will take longer. But we simply don't have time for things to take longer. And the last element is capability. How much are you willing to, of capability are you willing to give up to keep things under budget? Quite a challenge, and clearly this is what the Defence Strategic Review that the government has commissioned will be seeking to advise Minister Miles on.
We've only got 30 seconds left, but quickly, I want to get your thoughts on the armoured vehicle acquisition. I know it's a tight time, but if you can give me a quick snapshot, should the Army go ahead with this? We're talking multi-billion-dollar acquisition of modern-day tanks, essentially.
Yeah, Kieran, I've got to declare my bias. I'm an armour officer by background, but look, I think that the government has to fit in an enormous desire for modernisation in a fixed budget in a relatively finite amount of time. We've seen General Stewart coming out speaking very clearly and forcefully. I think that's fantastic. Stewart is a combat officer. People might know he led our troops in Uruzgan in combat, and so he knows what soldiers need around them. But there's more to do to explain to the people of Australia just what these vehicles are for and where they would be used. I think there's a compelling case, but I think we need to hear more about what they would be used for and under what circumstances. And they will be in consideration to see if the government can fit all of its desires into a budget that will be constrained.
Well, we'll talk about that in greater detail next time that we talk. Retired General Gus McLachlan, thank you for your insights as always. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Kieran.